The blood on Rebecca Morgan's hands had long since washed away, but the stain on her heart remained as permanent as the grave marker that bore her husband's name in the San Elizario cemetery. And she wondered if the 17 men who had come calling since Thomas died understood that some doors, once closed by grief, were never meant to open again. It was the summer of 1878 in western Texas, where the desert heat made mirages dance on the horizon and turned the earth to dust beneath wagon wheels. Rebecca had been a widow for 8 months, though it felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Thomas Morgan had been a good man, a cattle rancher who treated his wife with respect and kindness, even if their marriage had been more partnership than passion. When the fever took him last October, Rebecca found herself alone on 200 acres with a modest herd, a small ranch house, and a determination that surprised even herself. She was 26 years old, which the townspeople of San Elizario considered far too young to remain unmarried. The first suitor appeared barely 2 months after Thomas was buried. Harold Jenkins, a widower himself with 3 young children, came bearing a pie his eldest daughter had made and wearing his Sunday best on a Wednesday afternoon. "Mrs. Morgan," he had said, hat in his weathered hands, "I know this might seem premature, but a woman alone cannot run a ranch, and my children need a mother." Rebecca had looked at him standing on her porch, this man who saw her as a solution to his problems rather than a person with her own grief to bear. "Mr. Jenkins," she replied, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest, "I appreciate your concern, but I am managing just fine. Please give my regards to your children." She closed the door before he could respond, and she heard his heavy footsteps retreat across the wooden boards. That night, she sat in the kitchen Thomas had built, the pie untouched on the table, and allowed herself to cry. Not for the loss of a potential husband, but for the assumption that she needed one at all. The suitors kept coming. There was Benjamin Crawford, the banker who promised financial security while eyeing her land with poorly concealed interest. There was Frank Morrison, a neighboring rancher who needed a wife to cook for his 12 ranch hands. There was even young Deputy Cole Winters, barely 21 and blushing red as he stammered through a proposal that seemed more driven by his friend's dares than genuine affection. Rebecca refused them all with varying degrees of politeness, and with each rejection, her reputation in San Elizario shifted. The sympathetic widow became the stubborn widow. The poor grieving woman became the proud, difficult woman. She heard the whispers at the general store, saw the disapproving looks from the church ladies who believed a woman's place was beside a husband, any husband, rather than standing alone. "Let them talk," she told her reflection one morning as she braided her dark auburn hair. "Their opinions do not pay my bills or mend my fences." But the fences did need mending. The northern pasture fence had been deteriorating for months, and Rebecca knew she should fix it before the cattle wandered into the open desert. Thomas had always handled such repairs, and while Rebecca had learned much about running a ranch in the past 8 months, carpentry remained a skill that eluded her. She had tried twice to fix the sagging posts herself, only to have her repairs collapse within days. She considered hiring someone from town, but the idea of owing anyone a favor made her uneasy. Too many men in San Elizario saw a woman's need for help as an opportunity for courtship or worse, a chance to prove she could not manage alone. Rebecca had worked too hard to maintain her independence to surrender it now. It was early September when Xavier Grant first appeared in her life, though she did not notice him at first. He was one of those men who seemed to exist in the spaces between other people's attention, quiet and unobtrusive. He worked occasionally at the Foster Ranch 3 miles east, doing odd jobs and ranch hand work when it was available, and spending the rest of his time at a small cabin he rented on the outskirts of town. Xavier was 29 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that fell past his collar. His face was unremarkable except for his eyes, which were an unusual shade of gray-green and held a thoughtfulness that suggested he noticed more than he said. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were carefully chosen and softly delivered. Some folks thought him simple or slow, but those who knew him better understood that Xavier Grant was neither. He simply saw little value in filling the air with unnecessary noise. He had seen Rebecca Morgan in town several times, always walking with purpose, her spine straight and her expression guarded. He had watched her load feed sacks into her wagon without accepting help, had seen her haggle firmly but fairly with the general store owner, had noticed the way other women whispered behind their hands when she passed. Xavier had no interest in gossip, but he could not help observing her with a curiosity that went beyond casual notice. There was something about her that reminded him of a wild horse he had once gentled on a ranch in Colorado. Not broken, never broken, but wary and watchful, ready to bolt at the first sign of constraint. He admired that quality, recognized it perhaps, because he carried his own wariness like a second skin. Xavier had lost his own wife 3 years earlier, though the circumstances were different from Rebecca's loss. Margaret had been delicate, unsuited to the harsh Western life, and had died giving birth to a son who survived only hours longer than his mother. Xavier had buried them both in a town whose name he could no longer remember, and had drifted south and west, working where work was available, never staying long enough to form attachments that might lead to more loss. He did not consider himself lonely, exactly. Solitude was a choice, a protection, a way of moving through the world without the vulnerability that came from caring too much. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he wondered if protection and prison were really so different after all. It was a Tuesday morning when Xavier rode past the Morgan Ranch on his way to the Foster place. He noticed the fence immediately, the way a musician might notice a discordant note in a symphony. 3 posts were leaning dangerously, the wire sagging between them, and several cattle were grazing perilously close to the gap. It was the kind of problem that could escalate quickly, animals escaping, time and money lost recovering them. Xavier slowed his horse, studying the fence line with a practiced eye. He could see where someone had attempted repairs, the new nails driven at awkward angles, the wire twisted incorrectly. The work showed determination but lacked skill, and Xavier found himself wondering if Mrs. Morgan had done it herself. The thought bothered him more than it should have, the image of her struggling with posts and wire in the September heat. He rode on to the Foster Ranch, but the fence occupied his thoughts throughout the day. It was not his concern, he told himself. Rebecca Morgan had made it clear to every man in the county that she needed no assistance. Getting involved would be presumptuous at best, insulting at worst. But that evening, after his work was finished, Xavier found himself riding back toward the Morgan Ranch. He approached from the east, where the land dipped into a shallow valley that obscured his presence from the ranch house. The fence posts and wire he needed were in his saddle bags, purchased with his own money from the general store where the clerk had asked no questions. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and crimson as Xavier began to work. He moved methodically, removing the failed repairs, digging out the rotted posts, setting new ones deep in the hard ground. The physical labor felt good after a day of less demanding work, and he lost himself in the rhythm of it. Dig, set, tamp, secure. String the wire, tension it properly, fasten it tight. He worked in the failing light and then by the light of a half-moon, stopping only when the job was complete. The fence stood straight and strong, ready to hold for years if maintained properly. Xavier gathered his tools, erased as much evidence of his presence as possible, and rode away into the darkness. Rebecca discovered the repaired fence the next morning. She had gone out at dawn to check on the herd, expecting to find the same sagging wire she had seen for weeks. Instead, she found professional work, solid posts and properly strung wire. She stood staring at the fence for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities. Her first thought was that she had somehow forgotten hiring someone, but that was absurd. Her second thought was that one of the rejected suitors had done this, trying to prove his worth or create a sense of obligation. That thought made her furious. She did not want help that came with strings attached, did not want to owe anyone anything. She asked around town that afternoon, her questions careful and indirect. No one claimed credit for the work. Harold Jenkins looked confused when she mentioned it. Benjamin Crawford suggested she should be grateful regardless of who did it. Frank Morrison laughed and said if he was going to do work for free, it would be on his own ranch. The mystery gnawed at her. Rebecca was not a woman who enjoyed unsolved puzzles, and this fence represented something larger than simple carpentry. It was an intrusion, however well-intentioned, into her carefully maintained independence. 2 weeks later, the gate on her barn broke, the hinge rusted through after years of use. Rebecca spent an entire afternoon trying to fix it, but the work required welding equipment she did not own. She went to bed frustrated, already calculating the cost of hiring the blacksmith in town. The next morning, the gate hung straight and true, a new hinge welded perfectly in place. Rebecca stood in her barn doorway, a mixture of gratitude and annoyance warring in her chest. Someone was helping her, and she had no idea why or who. She became more watchful, rising early to patrol her property, staying up late to watch from her windows. But she saw nothing unusual, no signs of her mysterious benefactor. Whoever was doing this work had no interest in recognition or reward. It happened twice more over the next month. A section of roof shingles that had been damaged in a windstorm was repaired. A water trough that had developed a leak was sealed with fresh pitch. Each time, the work was done expertly and without fanfare, appearing like gifts from some invisible guardian. Rebecca began to feel haunted, but not unpleasantly. The presence, whoever it was, felt benevolent rather than threatening. Still, she needed to know. The not knowing felt like relinquishing control, and control was all she had left. It was early October, almost a year since Thomas's death, when Rebecca finally caught sight of him. She had stationed herself in the hay loft of her barn just after sunset, positioned where she could see most of her property without being easily visible herself. She waited for hours, fighting sleep, almost ready to give up when she saw movement near the chicken coop. A man on horseback, approaching slowly from the eastern pasture. He dismounted, tied his horse to a tree, and approached the coop with a handful of wooden slats. Rebecca had mentioned to the general store owner just that morning that she needed to replace some rotted boards on the coop. How had this man known? She climbed down from the loft as quietly as she could and made her way toward the coop. The moon was bright enough to see by, and she moved carefully, not wanting to startle him. As she drew closer, she could hear the soft sounds of work, the gentle tap of a hammer, the whisper of wood sliding into place. She was 10 feet away when she spoke. "Who are you?" The man froze, hammer in mid-swing. Slowly he turned to face her, and in the moonlight Rebecca could make out his features. She recognized him vaguely from town, one of the ranch hands who drifted in and out of San Elizario with the seasons. "Madam," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Did not mean to disturb you." "That does not answer my question," Rebecca replied, keeping her own voice steady. "Who are you, and why are you fixing my chicken coop in the middle of the night?" Xavier Grant set down his hammer carefully and straightened, meeting her eyes. In the moonlight, his face was all planes and shadows, impossible to read. "Name is Xavier Grant. I have been doing some work around your place." "I can see that," Rebecca said. "What I cannot see is why. What do you want from me?" It was the question she had been asking herself for weeks, the assumption she had made about every suitor who came calling. Everyone wanted something. Help came with expectations, with obligations, with prices to be paid. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words were simple and direct. "Nothing, madam. I want nothing from you." Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everyone wants something, Mr. Grant, so please spare us both the pretense and tell me what it is. Are you hoping I will marry you, sell you my land? What exactly do you expect in return for all this work?" She saw something flicker across his face, an emotion too quick to identify. He bent down, picked up his tools, and began placing them in a canvas bag. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said, not looking at her. "Month before that, I was working on a ranch in Colorado. There was a widow there struggling on her own. I saw she needed help, but I did not offer because I figured it was not my place, and I did not want her to think I had intentions. Week later, she was hurt trying to move a hay bale, broke her arm badly. Had to sell her place because she could not work it anymore, moved back east to live with family she did not like much." Xavier finished packing his tools and stood, the bag in his hand. "I watched her struggle when I could have helped, all because I was worried about appearances, about what people might think. Told myself it was about respecting her pride, but really I was just avoiding discomfort. When my Margaret died, I understood too late that sometimes people need help whether they ask for it or not, and that offering it is not the same as disrespecting their strength." He looked at Rebecca directly then, his gray-green eyes steady in the moonlight. "You do not need to marry me, Mrs. Morgan. You do not need to thank me or owe me anything. I have been watching you handle this place alone, and you are doing fine. But everyone needs help sometimes, and there is no shame in accepting it when it comes without strings." Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the armor she had built around herself. "If you wanted nothing, why not do the work during the day? Why hide?" "Because I knew you would refuse if I asked," Xavier said simply. "And because I thought if the work was just done, you would not have to fight your pride to accept it. Seems I miscalculated." He moved to walk past her, heading toward his horse, and Rebecca found herself speaking without planning the words. "Wait." Xavier stopped but did not turn around. "The chicken coop," Rebecca said. "You should finish what you started. Leaving it half done would be wasteful." She could not see his face, but she heard something in his voice that might have been relief or might have been satisfaction. "Yes, madam." Rebecca retreated to her porch and sat on the steps, watching as Xavier returned to his work. He moved with quiet efficiency, no wasted motion, no unnecessary noise. The hammer taps were precise and measured, the work of someone who knew his craft and took pride in doing it well. When he finished, he packed his tools again and walked toward his horse. He paused as he passed the porch, tipping his hat slightly. "Good night, Mrs. Morgan." "Mr. Grant," she acknowledged. Then, because the words felt necessary, "Thank you." He nodded once and rode away into the darkness, and Rebecca sat on her porch steps until the sun began to rise, thinking about kindness without obligation, about help that came without price, about a quiet man who fixed things in the night and asked nothing in return. The next day, Rebecca rode into town with a specific purpose. She found Xavier at the Foster Ranch, mending a corral fence alongside two other hands. She dismounted and walked over, aware that the other men were watching with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Grant," she said formally, "might I have a word?" Xavier set down his tools and walked a short distance away with her, his expression neutral. Up close in the daylight, Rebecca could see him more clearly. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, his features too weathered, his manner too reserved. But there was something solid about him, something trustworthy that she recognized instinctively. "I have been thinking about what you said," Rebecca began, choosing her words carefully. "About help without obligation. I appreciate what you have been doing, truly. But it does not sit right with me, you spending your own money and time on my property without compensation." Xavier started to speak, but Rebecca held up her hand. "Please, let me finish. I have a proposition. I need regular help around the ranch, work that requires skills I do not have. I would like to hire you properly for a fair wage. 2 days a week to start, more if the work demands it. This way there is no charity, no obligation beyond employer and employee. Does that seem acceptable?" Xavier studied her face for a moment, and Rebecca had the distinct impression he was seeing more than she intended to show. "That would be acceptable, madam, though I should mention that my time at the Foster place is irregular. I could guarantee Mondays and Thursdays if that suits your needs." "That suits them perfectly," Rebecca said, feeling an unexpected lightness in her chest. "We can discuss specific wages and duties tomorrow if you are available in the morning." "I will be there at dawn," Xavier said. As Rebecca rode back to her ranch, she felt the eyes of San Elizario upon her, felt the weight of speculation and judgment. Let them wonder, she thought. Let them talk. This was business, nothing more. She needed help with her ranch, and Xavier Grant was clearly skilled at the work. There was nothing improper about the arrangement. But that night, lying in bed, Rebecca admitted to herself that her reasoning was not entirely honest. There was something about Xavier that intrigued her, something beyond his carpentry skills. Perhaps it was the way he had helped without expecting anything in return. Perhaps it was the quiet respect in his manner, the way he listened more than he spoke. Or perhaps it was simply that he had lost someone too, and understood that grief was not something to be rushed through or solved with a hasty remarriage. Xavier arrived at dawn the next day, as promised. They discussed wages, and Rebecca offered what she considered fair. Xavier accepted without negotiation, which made her suspect she might be paying him more than necessary, but his expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. They established a routine quickly. Xavier would arrive early on Mondays and Thursdays, assess what needed doing, and complete the work with minimal conversation. Rebecca found herself watching him sometimes, noting the careful way he approached each task, the thoughtfulness he brought to even minor repairs. He was different from Thomas, who had been gregarious and social, always ready with a joke or a story. Xavier's silence might have been off-putting if it felt cold, but instead it was comfortable, the quiet of someone at peace with himself. Rebecca discovered she could work alongside him without feeling the need to fill the air with chatter, a relief after months of guarding her words against suitors who might interpret friendliness as encouragement. October passed into November, the desert heat giving way to cooler temperatures. The anniversary of Thomas's death came and went, and Rebecca marked it quietly. Alone except for the hours Xavier spent replacing several fence posts in the south pasture. He seemed to understand without being told that she needed space that day, working at a distance, and leaving without requiring more than a brief acknowledgement. It was late November when Rebecca realized she was beginning to depend on Xavier's presence in ways that went beyond his labor. She found herself planning projects for Mondays and Thursdays, saving certain tasks because she wanted to ask his opinion or watch how he approached them. She began to notice small things about him. The way he always checked on the horses before starting other work, how he saved spare nails and wire rather than wasting them, the careful way he handled injured animals with a gentleness that contrasted with his weathered appearance. One Thursday afternoon, as Xavier was finishing repairs on the barn door, Rebecca brought out 2 cups of coffee. It was the first time she had offered him anything beyond water, and she felt oddly nervous as she approached. "Thought you might like something warm," she said, extending one of the cups. Xavier looked surprised but accepted the coffee with a quiet, "Thank you, madam." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their drinks. Then Rebecca, feeling brave or perhaps just tired of her own caution, said, "You mentioned your wife died 3 years ago. What was her name?" Xavier's hand tightened slightly on the cup, but his voice remained steady. "Margaret. She was from Boston, came west with her family when she was 18. We married a year later." "Was she happy here?" Rebecca asked gently. Xavier considered the question, his gaze distant. "No, she tried to be for my sake, but the West was too harsh for her. She missed green things, missed rain, missed the life she had known. I should have taken her back east, but I was stubborn, thought I could make her love it as I did." He paused, then added quietly, "She died giving birth. The baby, a son, he did not survive either." Rebecca felt her throat tighten with sympathy. "I am sorry. That is a heavy loss." "And you," Xavier said, turning the conversation with the same gentleness she had shown him, "you lost your husband to fever." "Yes," Rebecca said. "Last October. Thomas was a good man, kind and fair. Our marriage was arranged by our families back in Missouri, but we grew fond of each other over time. I cannot say it was a great love story, but we were partners, friends. I miss him, but perhaps not in the way a widow is supposed to." It was the most honest she had been about her marriage with anyone, and she was not entirely sure why she felt safe sharing it with Xavier. Perhaps because he understood loss without romanticizing it, recognized that grief could be complicated and still be real. "I think there are many ways to miss someone," Xavier said quietly. "No right or wrong to it." They finished their coffee in silence, and when Xavier left that evening, Rebecca found herself already looking forward to Monday. December brought occasional cold snaps and the approach of Christmas. Rebecca had planned to spend the holiday alone, as she had spent most days since Thomas's death. But a week before Christmas, her nearest neighbor, Martha Henderson, stopped by with an invitation. "We are having a gathering on Christmas Eve," Martha said, her round face hopeful. "Nothing fancy, just neighbors and friends. You should come, Rebecca. It has been too long since you joined the community for anything social." Rebecca's first instinct was to refuse, but something made her hesitate. "Will there be many people?" "A dozen or so," Martha said. "The Fosters will be there, and the Carters, and we told that nice Mr. Grant he should come too, since he has been helping so many folks with odd jobs this winter." Rebecca felt her heart skip slightly at Xavier's name. "I see. Well, perhaps I will stop by for a little while." Martha beamed. "Wonderful. Come at sunset. We will have food and music. Oh, Rebecca, it will be so good to see you among people again." As Martha drove away in her wagon, Rebecca stood on her porch and wondered what she had just agreed to. Social gatherings made her nervous now. Too many opportunities for awkward questions or pitying looks. But the thought of seeing Xavier in a different context intrigued her, and she found herself actually considering what she might wear. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold. Rebecca dressed in her best dress, a deep green wool that she had not worn since before Thomas's death. She braided her hair and pinned it up, studying her reflection with critical eyes. She looked pale and serious, but not unattractive. The observation surprised her. She had not thought about her appearance in months beyond basic cleanliness and practicality. The Henderson ranch was warm and bright when Rebecca arrived, lanterns glowing in the windows and the sound of fiddle music drifting into the evening air. She felt her anxiety spike as she approached the door, but Martha welcomed her with such genuine warmth that some of her tension eased. The room was full of familiar faces, neighbors she had known for years, but kept at arm's length since becoming a widow. They greeted her kindly, without the prying questions she had feared, and Rebecca found herself relaxing into the celebration. She saw Xavier across the room, standing near the fireplace with a cup of cider in his hand. He was dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, in a clean shirt and vest, his hair trimmed and combed back. He caught her eye and nodded slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, but Rebecca felt warmth spread through her chest. The evening progressed pleasantly. There was food and music, conversation and laughter. Rebecca spoke with several people, surprised to find that she had missed this sense of community more than she realized. She had been so focused on maintaining her independence that she had isolated herself entirely, mistaking solitude for strength. She was helping Martha clear dishes when one of the men, Samuel Foster, started telling stories about the worst ranch hands he had ever hired. The stories were funny and exaggerated, and everyone was laughing. Then Samuel said, "But Xavier here, he is the opposite of those fools. Best worker I have ever had and the quietest. Man can do a full day's work and speak maybe 10 words total." Everyone laughed, but Xavier just smiled slightly and shrugged. "Talk does not mend fences." "True enough," Samuel agreed. "Though I keep telling him he should find a place of his own, settle down proper. Man with his skills could run a fine ranch." Xavier's expression shuddered slightly, and Rebecca felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. She spoke before thinking. Not everyone wants to be settled. Some people prefer the freedom to move as they choose. Samuel looked at her in surprise, as did several others. But Xavier's eyes met hers across the room, and she saw gratitude there, a silent acknowledgement that she had understood something others missed. Later in the evening, as the party was winding down, Rebecca found herself outside on the porch, taking a breath of cold air. She heard the door open behind her and turned to find Xavier stepping out. "Getting stuffy in there," he said by way of explanation. "Yes," Rebecca agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. Then Rebecca said, "Thank you for the work you have been doing, not just at my place but for others too. Martha mentioned you repaired their well pump last week." Xavier shrugged. "Pump needed fixing." "You are a good man, Xavier Grant," Rebecca said quietly. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him notice, saw something shift in his expression. "Just trying to be useful," he replied. Then, after a pause, "You look very nice this evening, Mrs. Morgan. That color suits you." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." It was a small moment, insignificant perhaps to anyone observing, but Rebecca felt its weight. This was not the forced flattery of suitors hoping to win her hand and her land. This was honest appreciation, freely given and asking nothing in return. "I should be getting home," Rebecca said eventually, though she was reluctant to leave. "Thank you for the conversation." "Safe ride, Mrs. Morgan," Xavier said, and Rebecca thought she heard reluctance in his voice too. Christmas Day was quiet and solitary, but Rebecca found she did not mind as much as she had expected. She spent the morning tending to her animals and the afternoon reading by the fire, Thomas's Bible open in her lap. She thought about the past year, about loss and survival, about the slow transformation from Thomas's wife to her own person. She thought about Xavier, too, more than she probably should have. About his quiet kindness, his steady presence, the way he seemed to see her as a whole person rather than a problem to solve or a prize to win. The feelings developing in her chest were confusing and a little frightening. She had not expected to feel drawn to anyone again, had convinced herself that the part of her capable of romantic affection had been buried with Thomas. But these feelings were different from what she had felt for Thomas. With her late husband, there had been affection and respect built over years of partnership. With Xavier, there was something more immediate and intense, a pull she did not fully understand. Perhaps it was gratitude for his help, she told herself. Perhaps it was simply loneliness after months of isolation. Or perhaps, a small voice whispered in her mind, it was the beginning of something real. Winter deepened, bringing occasional snow that dusted the desert in white before melting by afternoon. Xavier continued his work at the ranch, and Rebecca found herself inventing projects just to extend his time there. They talked more now, small conversations that revealed pieces of themselves gradually. She learned that Xavier had grown up in Kansas, the youngest of 6 children on a wheat farm. That he had learned carpentry from his father and ranch work from necessity. That he loved the open spaces of the West, the way the sky seemed endless and the land demanded both respect and resilience. He learned that Rebecca had always been independent-minded, even as a girl in Missouri. That she had agreed to marry Thomas not out of obedience but out of a desire for adventure, seeing the West as an escape from a life that felt too small and prescribed. That she missed her younger sister, still back in Missouri, but had no desire to return to that life. One Monday in late January, Xavier arrived to find Rebecca struggling with an injured calf. The animal had gotten tangled in wire and had several deep cuts that needed tending. Xavier immediately set down his tools and came to help, his hands gentle but sure as he examined the wounds. "We need to clean these thoroughly," he said. "Do you have iodine?" Rebecca retrieved the medical supplies, and together they worked on the calf. Xavier held the frightened animal still while Rebecca cleaned and dressed the wounds, murmuring soothing sounds. When they finished, both of them were spattered with mud and blood, but the calf seemed calmer, standing shakily in the barn. "He should heal up fine," Xavier said, washing his hands in the water trough. "Just need to keep the wounds clean and watch for infection." Rebecca nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how his shirt sleeves were rolled up showing strong forearms, how his hair had fallen across his forehead. She felt her breath catch, felt an unexpected surge of desire that shocked her with its intensity. Xavier must have seen something in her expression because his eyes darkened, a flash of answering heat before he stepped back, creating distance. "I should get to work on that fence line," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Yes," Rebecca managed, her own voice not quite steady. "Of course." He left the barn quickly, and Rebecca stood alone among the hay and horses, pressing her hands to her burning cheeks. This was dangerous territory. These feelings she could no longer pretend were simple gratitude or friendship. She was attracted to Xavier Grant, drawn to him in ways both physical and emotional, and she had no idea what to do about it. The proper thing would be to maintain distance, to keep their relationship strictly professional. But Rebecca found she had no interest in the proper thing. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt alive in a way that went beyond mere survival. She felt want, need, desire. And while it frightened her, it also felt like waking up after a long sleep. Over the next weeks, The tension between them grew. Rebecca caught Xavier watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, his expression unguarded and hungry. She found excuses to stand close to him, to brush against his arm when handing him tools, to laugh at his rare attempts at humor. They were circling each other like wary animals, both aware of the attraction but neither willing to make the first move. It was early February when everything changed. Rebecca had gone into town for supplies, and on her way home, one of her wagon wheels hit a deep rut. She heard the crack of splintering wood and felt the wagon lurch dangerously to the side. She managed to stop the horses before the wagon overturned completely, but she was stranded 2 miles from home with a broken wheel and a wagon full of supplies. She considered her options. It was late afternoon, and the temperature was dropping. She could unhitch one of the horses and ride for help, but that would mean leaving her supplies vulnerable to theft or animal damage. She was debating the best course when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Xavier appeared over the rise, riding at a pace faster than his usual careful trot. He must have seen the wagon from a distance, must have realized immediately that something was wrong. He dismounted quickly, his eyes scanning her for injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "No, just frustrated," Rebecca said. "The wheel is broken. I was just deciding whether to ride for help or wait with the wagon." Xavier examined the wheel, his expression grim. "It is too damaged to repair here. We need to get the wagon to your place or to town." He looked at the darkening sky, calculating. "Sun will be down in less than an hour. We do not have time to make town." "Can we make it to my ranch?" Rebecca asked. "If we redistribute the weight and tie the wheel in place, maybe. But it will be slow going, and there is a risk of the wagon breaking further." Rebecca made the decision quickly. "My ranch, then. Better to risk it than spend the night out here in the cold." They worked together efficiently, Xavier using rope and spare wood to stabilize the broken wheel as much as possible. They redistributed the supplies, lightening the load on the damaged side. By the time they finished, the sun was touching the horizon, and Rebecca could see her breath in the cold air. The journey back to her ranch was tense and slow. Xavier led the horses carefully, avoiding ruts and rocks, while Rebecca walked alongside ready to steady the wagon if it threatened to tip. Full darkness fell before they were halfway home, and they continued by moonlight, neither speaking, all their attention focused on keeping the wagon upright. They finally reached the ranch well after dark, both exhausted and cold. Xavier helped Rebecca unhitch the horses and unload the most perishable supplies. The rest could wait until morning. They worked in the barn by lantern light, neither acknowledging how close they stood to one another, how their hands brushed with each passing moment. When the horses were stabled and fed, Rebecca turned to Xavier, intending to thank him. But the words died on her lips when she saw the way he was looking at her. There was nothing guarded in his expression now, nothing careful or controlled. He looked at her with open longing, with a hunger that matched her own. "Rebecca," he said, her name rough in his throat. She moved without thinking, closing the distance between them, and then his arms were around her and his mouth was on hers. The kiss was desperate and hungry, full of weeks of denied attraction and years of loneliness. Rebecca pressed against him, her fingers tangling in his hair, and felt him groan against her lips. They broke apart breathing hard, and Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should not have done that," he said, though his arms remained tight around her waist. "I am sorry. I do not apologize," Rebecca interrupted. "Do not you dare apologize." She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "I wanted that. I have wanted it for weeks." "Rebecca," Xavier said again, and this time her name was a prayer, a question, a plea. "I cannot offer you much. I have no land, no real home. I am just a drifter with some carpentry skills and a past full of loss." "I do not need much," Rebecca said fiercely. "I have land, I have a home. What I need is someone who sees me as I am, not as a solution to their problems or a prize to win. What I need is you, Xavier, if you want to be here." "Want?" Xavier laughed, the sound strained. "I have wanted nothing but you for months. But I was afraid of pushing you, afraid of losing you before I even had you." "You have me," Rebecca said, and kissed him again to prove it. This kiss was slower, deeper, full of promise and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. They stood in the barn for a long time, holding each other, talking quietly about things they had been afraid to say before. Xavier told her about the first time he saw her in town, how something in her bearing had struck him immediately. Rebecca confessed to watching him work, to inventing projects just to keep him around longer. They laughed at their own foolishness, at the weeks of careful distance when they had both wanted the same thing. Eventually, the cold drove them from the barn. Xavier prepared to mount his horse to ride back to his rented cabin in town, but Rebecca caught his hand. "Stay," she said quietly. "It is late and cold, and the cabin has a spare room. You can ride back in the morning." Xavier searched her face, looking for certainty. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded. "All right." They walked to the house together, their hands linked. Rebecca was acutely aware of the impropriety of having a man stay overnight, of what the neighbors would say if they knew. But she found she did not care. Let them talk. This was her life, her choice, her heart to risk as she saw fit. She showed Xavier to the spare room, the one that had been meant for future children that never came. "There are extra blankets in the chest if you need them," she said from the doorway. "Thank you," Xavier said. Then, before she could leave, "Rebecca, I want you to know that I respect you too much to assume anything. What happened in the barn, that does not mean you owe me anything or that I expect." Rebecca crossed the room and kissed him quiet. "I know," she said against his lips. "You have been showing me that for months, Xavier Grant. You have asked nothing of me, expected nothing, demanded nothing. That is precisely why I trust you with everything." She left him then, retreating to her own room before she could change her mind. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of him moving around the house, the creak of floorboards, the sound of water in the wash basin. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had shared in this house, and found she felt no guilt for the feelings blooming in her heart. Thomas had been a good husband, but he was gone, and she was still alive. She had mourned him honestly and well. Now it was time to live again. Sleep took a long time to come, and when it did, Rebecca dreamed of gray-green eyes and calloused hands, of fences mended and hearts made whole. Morning arrived cold and bright. Rebecca woke early and dressed quickly, her heart beating faster than usual as she made her way to the kitchen. She found Xavier already up, building up the fire in the stove, his movements quiet and careful. "Good morning," she said, and he turned with a smile that transformed his usually solemn face. "Morning," he replied. "I hope you do not mind I started coffee." "I do not mind at all," Rebecca said. They moved around the kitchen in an easy dance, preparing breakfast together. It felt natural and right, this domestic intimacy, as though they had been doing it for years rather than days. Over coffee and eggs, they talked about practical matters. Xavier needed to fix her wagon wheel properly. There was work to be done at the Foster Ranch. Rebecca needed to make another trip to town soon for the supplies she had not been able to unload last night. But beneath the practical conversation was something else, an awareness of how their relationship had shifted, of decisions that needed to be made. Finally, after their plates were empty and their coffee cups drained, Xavier spoke what they were both thinking. "People will talk," he said quietly. If I start spending more time here, if we are seen together more often. San Elizario is a small town, and you have already dealt with more than your share of gossip. People have been talking about me since Thomas died, Rebecca said firmly. I cannot control their tongues, but I can control my own choices. I know what I want, Xavier. The question is what you want. Xavier reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I want you. I want a life with you if you will have me, but I will not ruin your reputation or make things harder for you than they already are. We should do this properly, courting and such, give people time to get used to the idea. Rebecca felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, at his consideration and care. Courting sounds nice, she agreed. Though I should warn you, I am out of practice. I have refused so many suitors that I am not sure I remember how to accept one. You are doing fine so far, Xavier said with a smile. Besides, we have been courting in our own way for months now. We just did not call it that. They spent the rest of the morning working together on the wagon wheel. Xavier's repair was masterful, reinforcing the damaged wood and replacing the broken spokes with such skill that the wheel looked as good as new. Rebecca watched him work, admiring the confidence in his movements, the care he took with every detail. When the work was done, Xavier prepared to leave. He had obligations at the Foster Ranch, work he had committed to and would not shirk. But he paused before mounting his horse, pulling Rebecca close for a long kiss that promised more than it delivered. I will come by tomorrow if that suits you, he said. We could ride into town together, let people see us, start making our intentions clear. I would like that, Rebecca said. She stood on her porch and watched him ride away, her heart full in a way it had not been since before Thomas died. Perhaps even before that, if she was honest. What she felt for Xavier was different, deeper, more intense than the comfortable affection she had shared with her late husband. True to his word, Xavier arrived the next afternoon. They rode into San Elizario together, and Rebecca was acutely aware of the eyes that followed them. Xavier helped her down from her horse outside the general store, his hand lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Inside, she saw Martha Henderson browsing bolts of fabric. Martha's eyes widened when she saw Rebecca and Xavier together, and Rebecca steeled herself for questions or judgment. But Martha simply smiled, a genuine warm expression, and said, "Good afternoon, Rebecca. Mr. Grant." "Lovely day, is it not?" "Lovely," Rebecca agreed, surprised and relieved. As they completed their errands, more people noticed them together. Some looks were curious, some disapproving, but many were simply accepting. Rebecca realized that perhaps she had built up the town's judgment in her mind more than was warranted. Yes, some people would gossip, but others were simply glad to see her moving forward with her life. That evening, as Xavier prepared to leave her ranch, he said, "That went better than I expected." "Better than I expected, too," Rebecca admitted, "though I suspect we will still hear plenty of talk." "Let them talk," Xavier said, echoing her own words from months ago. "As long as we know the truth of what is between us, their opinions do not matter." February gave way to March, and Rebecca and Xavier's courtship continued. He still came to work at her ranch twice a week, but now he also came on Sundays, and they would ride together across her property or simply sit on the porch talking. He was teaching her carpentry, patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise when she succeeded. They were careful about propriety, never giving the town real cause for scandal. Xavier never stayed overnight again, always riding back to his cabin before full dark. But within the boundaries of respectability, they grew closer. Rebecca learned the feel of his hand in hers, the solid warmth of his body when he held her, the taste of his kisses in the quiet moments when they were alone. She learned, too, about the depth of his character. Xavier was a man of integrity, someone who kept his word and treated all people with respect. He had a dry sense of humor that revealed itself gradually, and a kindness that extended beyond grand gestures to small daily considerations. He remembered that she disliked coffee that was too strong, that she worried about her cattle in the weeks before calving season, that she missed her sister back in Missouri. In turn, she shared herself with him more fully than she had with anyone. She told him about her childhood, about the expectations and limitations that had driven her west. She spoke of her marriage to Thomas with honesty, neither romanticizing it nor diminishing what it had been. She shared her fears about the ranch, about her ability to keep it running, about losing her independence if she married again. "You would not lose it with me," Xavier said quietly. "This is your land, Rebecca. It would remain yours, legally and practically. I have no interest in taking what is yours. I only want to share it to help build it into something even stronger." "What about children?" Rebecca asked, the question she had been afraid to voice. "Do you want more children after what happened with Margaret?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment. "The loss almost destroyed me," he admitted. "For a long time, I thought I could never risk that kind of pain again. But yes, if we are blessed with children, I would welcome them. The risk of loss is the price of love, I think. We cannot have one without the possibility of the other." Rebecca thought about that often in the weeks that followed. She had been so focused on protecting herself from loss that she had nearly closed herself off from the possibility of love entirely. Xavier had shown her that vulnerability and strength were not opposites, that opening her heart did not mean surrendering her independence. It was mid-April when Xavier made his proposal. Though in typical fashion, it was nothing like the grand gestures of the suitors Rebecca had refused. They were in the barn, mucking out stalls together, both of them dirty and sweaty from the work. Xavier was explaining a new irrigation technique he had read about when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "I think we should get married," he said, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. Rebecca, who had been filling a water bucket, nearly dropped it. "I am sorry, what?" Xavier set down his shovel and turned to face her fully. "I think we should get married. I am in love with you, Rebecca. I want to spend my life with you, working this ranch, building something together. I know I should probably do this more romantically, with a ring and pretty words, but the truth is simple enough. I love you. Will you marry me?" Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes, but she was smiling. "You choose to propose in a barn while we are mucking out horse stalls." "Seemed as good a place as any," Xavier said, but she could see the nervousness in his eyes, the fear that she might refuse. "We have done our best talking in this barn. Felt right." Rebecca crossed to him, heedless of the dirt on both of them, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Grant. I love you too." The kiss that followed was long and deep, full of joy and relief and promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing, giddy with happiness. "I do not have a ring yet," Xavier admitted. "I have been saving, but I wanted to ask you first. Make sure you would say yes before I spent the money." "I do not need a fancy ring," Rebecca said. "A simple band will do, something practical that will not catch on things while I am working." Then, because the thought had been building for weeks, she added, "When should we do this? I do not want a long engagement, Xavier. I have waited long enough for happiness." "As soon as you want," Xavier said immediately. "Tomorrow, next week, whenever you say." They settled on 4 weeks, enough time to arrange things properly, but not so long as to be frustrating. Rebecca wrote to her sister in Missouri, inviting her to the wedding. Xavier made arrangements with the preacher in San Elizario and ordered simple rings from the jeweler. Rebecca bought fabric for a new dress, refusing Martha Henderson's offers to help with the sewing, wanting to make it herself. The 4 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. There was work to be done on the ranch, arrangements to make, practical considerations to address. Xavier moved his few belongings from his rented cabin to the ranch, though he continued to sleep in the spare room until the wedding, maintaining propriety to the last. The town's reaction to their engagement was mixed, but mostly positive. Some of the women who had gossiped about Rebecca now congratulated her warmly, relieved perhaps that she was conforming to expectations by remarrying. The men who had proposed and been rejected reacted with varying degrees of grace. Harold Jenkins was stiffly polite. Benjamin Crawford muttered something about her coming to her senses eventually. Frank Morrison actually seemed genuinely happy for her, shaking Xavier's hand and wishing them well. Rebecca's sister, Rose, arrived a week before the wedding, traveling by train and then stagecoach to reach San Elizario. Rebecca had not seen her in almost 3 years, and the reunion was tearful and joyous. Rose was 2 years younger, newly married herself to a merchant back in Missouri, and full of questions about Rebecca's life and upcoming wedding. "Tell me everything about him," Rose demanded the first night, as they sat together in the kitchen after Xavier had left. "Is he kind? Does he treat you well? Are you truly in love, or is this a practical match?" Rebecca smiled, thinking of Xavier's quiet strength, his patient kindness, the way he made her feel both protected and free. "I am truly in love," she said. "More than I ever thought possible. He is a good man, Rose. The best man I have ever known." "Then I am happy for you," Rose said, squeezing her sister's hand. "You deserve this, Becca. You deserve to be loved well." The wedding day arrived warm and clear, the Texas sky brilliantly blue above the desert landscape. It was held at the small church in San Elizario, with most of the town in attendance. Rebecca wore her new dress, a simple but elegant cream-colored cotton, and Xavier wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. They stood before the preacher and spoke their vows, their voices steady and sure. Rebecca looked into Xavier's gray-green eyes and saw her future there, saw years of partnership and passion, of work and joy, of building a life together from the foundation they had already laid. "I do," she said when the moment came, and meant it with her whole heart. "I do," Xavier echoed and slid the simple gold band onto her finger. The kiss that sealed their marriage was chaste and brief, appropriate for the setting, but Rebecca felt its promise. Tonight, finally, they would truly belong to each other in every way. The reception was held at the Henderson Ranch, with food and music and dancing. Rebecca found herself passed from neighbor to neighbor, receiving congratulations and good wishes. Xavier stayed close, his hand frequently finding hers, his presence a steady anchor in the celebration. As the sun began to set, they made their excuses and left, riding back to their ranch under a sky painted in shades of orange and pink. The house that had been Rebecca's alone for so long was now theirs together, and the thought filled her with happiness. That night, in the bedroom she had once shared with Thomas, Rebecca and Xavier came together as husband and wife. Their union was tender and passionate, full of the longing they had carefully controlled for months. Rebecca discovered new depths to her capacity for pleasure, new ways of connecting with another person. Xavier was patient and attentive, learning her body as carefully as he approached everything else, bringing her to heights she had never imagined. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the darkness, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Xavier's hand traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and Rebecca felt completely, perfectly content. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Xavier replied. "Thank you for taking a chance on a quiet drifter with nothing much to offer." Rebecca raised herself on one elbow, looking down at him seriously. "You offered me everything that mattered, Xavier. You offered me respect and partnership and love without conditions. That is worth more than all the land and money in Texas." He pulled her down for a long kiss and they made love again, slower this time, savoring every touch and sensation. Rebecca fell asleep in her husband's arms, happier than she had ever been. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, as all marriages are. They learned each other's habits and rhythms, the small irritations and large joys of shared life. Xavier proved to be easy to live with, naturally tidy and considerate. He took genuine pleasure in the ranch work, bringing new ideas and improvements that increased their productivity. Rebecca discovered she liked being married to Xavier far more than she had enjoyed being married to Thomas, though she would never voice that comparison aloud. With Thomas, she had been a junior partner, expected to support and assist. With Xavier, she was an equal, her opinion sought and valued. They made decisions together, worked side by side, built their life as a true partnership. Summer brought the hard work of cattle drives and hay harvests. Xavier hired additional hands when necessary, men he had worked with before and trusted. The ranch prospered under their joint management, the herd growing, the land yielding well. In late August, Rebecca began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited a few more weeks to be certain before telling Xavier, wanting to be sure before raising hopes that might be disappointed. When she was finally confident, she told him over breakfast one morning, simply and directly. "I am with child," she said. "Due in early spring, I think." Xavier's face transformed, joy and fear and wonder all mingling in his expression. He came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could feel his answer in the way he held her. "Happier than I have any right to be," he said roughly. Terrified too, after what happened with Margaret, but mostly just grateful beyond words. They held each other for a long time, and Rebecca felt Xavier's silent tears against her neck, understood they were for both past loss and present hope. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, much to everyone's relief. Rebecca remained active on the ranch as long as she could, only gradually reducing her work as her body changed. Xavier was attentive, but not smothering, understanding her need to remain capable and involved even as he worried about her health. Winter came, milder than the previous year but still cold enough to make ranch work challenging. Rebecca spent more time indoors, preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and arranging the spare room as a nursery. Rose sent a package from Missouri, full of baby things and a long letter of sisterly advice. Xavier worked tirelessly to ensure everything was ready, reinforcing the house against winter drafts, stockpiling firewood, making sure they had everything they might need. He rode into town and arranged for the doctor to be available when the time came, paying him a retainer to ensure his presence. In late March, as the desert began to warm and bloom again, Rebecca went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Xavier stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, offering water and encouragement, his own face pale with worry. But unlike the tragedy that had haunted him for years, this birth ended in joy. Their son was born healthy and squalling, with a good set of lungs and an impressive appetite. They named him Thomas Michael Grant, honoring Rebecca's first husband and Xavier's father. Rebecca held her son for the first time and felt overwhelming love wash through her. Xavier sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "We did it," Rebecca whispered. "We have a family, Xavier." "We do," he agreed, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for him, for everything. The first months of parenthood were exhausting but wonderful. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and alert, and both Rebecca and Xavier fell completely in love with him. They took turns with nighttime feedings, shared the work of caring for him, marveled together at every small development and change. Spring brought new life to the ranch as well. The cattle calved successfully, the spring rains were generous, and the grass grew thick and green. Xavier hired 2 reliable hands for the busy season, men who proved trustworthy and hardworking. As summer approached, Rebecca stood on her porch one evening with Thomas in her arms, watching Xavier work with the new hands to repair a section of fence. She thought about the past 2 years, about how completely her life had transformed. She had gone from grieving widow to independent rancher to wife and mother, each transformation bringing new challenges and new joys. Xavier saw her watching and waved, his smile visible even from a distance. Rebecca waved back, her heart full. This was what happiness looked like, she thought. Not the absence of struggle or loss, but the presence of love and purpose and partnership. That night, after Thomas was asleep and the ranch was quiet, Rebecca and Xavier sat together on the porch enjoying the cool evening air. Xavier's arm was around her shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth contentedly. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up the drifting life, settling down here with all the responsibilities that come with it?" Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "No," he said finally. "I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was purpose. A place to belong, people to belong to." "You gave me that, Rebecca. You and Thomas. This is home in a way nowhere has been since I was a boy." "I am glad," Rebecca said, "because I cannot imagine doing any of this without you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The future stretched before them, full of possibility and promise. There would be challenges, Rebecca knew. Ranching was never easy and parenthood brought its own complications. But they would face it all together, as partners and equals, as lovers and friends. The years passed in the way years do, each one bringing its own mixture of joy and difficulty. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to boy, curious and energetic and full of life. When he was 3, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Rose, named for her grandmother and aunt. 2 years after that, another son arrived, William Xavier, completing their family. The ranch prospered under their careful management. Xavier's improvements to irrigation and grazing rotation increased their productivity significantly. Rebecca proved to have a talent for managing the business side of things, negotiating better prices for their cattle and making smart investments that secured their future. They became respected members of the San Elizario community, known for their fair dealing and hard work. Xavier served on the town council for several years, his quiet wisdom valued in local matters. Rebecca helped establish a school, ensuring that the children of the area, including her own, had access to education. The children who had once whispered about the difficult widow now saw only a successful rancher and devoted mother. The men who had courted her found other wives or moved on to other towns. Life continued its inevitable forward march, and the past became simply that the past, informing the present but not controlling it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier gave Rebecca a gift that surprised her. It was a hand-carved sign, beautifully made, reading Morgan Grant Ranch in elegant letters. "I know it has always been the Morgan Ranch," Xavier said as she examined the sign. "Your land from your first marriage. But I thought maybe it could be both our names now, a recognition of what we have built together." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. She thought of Thomas, her first husband who had brought her to this land and started the ranch. She thought of Xavier, who had helped her save it and transform it into something greater. Both men had given her important things, different but valuable in their own ways. "I love it," she said. "It is perfect." They hung the sign together at the ranch entrance, and that evening Rebecca stood looking at it with satisfaction. Morgan Grant Ranch, a name that honored her past and celebrated her present, that recognized both where she had been and where she was going. That night as they lay in bed, Rebecca said, "Do you remember the first time you fixed my fence?" Xavier chuckled. "I remember sneaking around like a thief, convinced you would run me off if you caught me." "I almost did," Rebecca admitted. "I was so determined to need nothing from anyone, to prove I could manage alone. I am grateful you were too stubborn to listen." "I am grateful you eventually stopped fighting and let me love you," Xavier replied, pulling her closer. "Best decision I ever made," Rebecca said, and kissed him to prove it. As their children grew, Thomas showed an interest in ranching, following his father around and learning the work with eager attention. Elizabeth proved to have her mother's head for business, already at 8 years old organizing her brothers and negotiating for extra dessert with the skill of a born trader. William was still young, but showed signs of inheriting his father's quiet thoughtfulness and his mother's determination. Rebecca and Xavier watched their children grow with pride and joy, seeing the best of both of them reflected in the next generation. They taught them the value of hard work and fair dealing, the importance of helping neighbors and keeping your word. They taught them, too, about loss and resilience, about the courage it takes to risk your heart and the rewards that come from loving well. On warm evenings, the family would gather on the porch, and Rebecca would sometimes tell stories of the ranch's history. She spoke of their grandfather Thomas, who had first established the ranch and been a good and honorable man. She spoke of their father Xavier, who had appeared quietly one day and changed everything with his kindness and skill. And sometimes, in the telling, she would look at Xavier and see him smiling, understanding that their love story was now woven permanently into the fabric of the land they had built together. The children would eventually grow and make their own paths. Thomas would stay on the ranch, eventually taking over its management with his wife beside him. Elizabeth would move to San Antonio, starting a business that would prove remarkably successful. William would become a veterinarian, traveling between ranches providing care for animals across West Texas. But all of that was in the future. For now, they were simply a family, working together, loving each other, building a life on the Texas desert under the endless western sky. Years later, when Rebecca was in her 50s and Xavier's hair had gone silver, they would sometimes sit on their porch in the evening and watch the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch was quiet then, the children grown and gone to their own lives, though they visited often with grandchildren in tow. "You remember when I refused every suitor in San Elizario?" Rebecca asked one such evening, her hand clasped in Xavier's weathered one. "I remember," Xavier said. "You were formidable. Half the men in town were terrified of you." "Good," Rebecca said with satisfaction. "I was not interested in men who wanted to save me or own me. I was waiting for someone who would simply love me as I was." "And did you find him?" Xavier asked, though his smile showed he knew the answer. "I did," Rebecca said, "though I did not find him exactly. He found me, or rather, he found my fence and fixed it without asking." "Best fence I ever mended," Xavier said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropping with the coming night. Inside the house they had shared for decades, the house where they had raised 3 children and built a life together, A lamp glowed warm and welcoming. Rebecca thought about all the years between that first fixed fence and this moment. Years of work and joy, struggle and triumph, loss and growth. She thought about the woman she had been, angry and grieving and determined to need no one. She thought about the woman she had become, still strong and independent but no longer afraid to share her strength, to accept help, to love and be loved in return. "I would do it all again," she said quietly. "Every moment, every choice, every struggle, it all led here to this life with you." Xavier squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the last light of the sunset. "As would I. You were worth waiting for, Rebecca Grant, worth every patient moment, every quiet repair, every risk." As darkness settled over the Morgan Grant ranch, they rose and went inside together. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed when they needed it most. The fence that had brought them together was long since replaced, but its memory lived on, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come not with grand gestures but with quiet service, not with demands but with patient devotion, not with force but with gentle, persistent love. And in the end, that love had built not just a life but a legacy. Roots that ran deep in the Texas soil and branches that reached toward the future, strong and enduring as the land itself. The story of the widow who refused every suitor and the quiet cowboy who fixed her fence without asking became a favorite tale in San Elizario, told and retold over the years. It was a reminder that love comes in its own time and its own way, that the right person appears not when we are looking but when we are ready, that sometimes the greatest strength lies in allowing ourselves to be vulnerable enough to accept help, to trust again, to love once more. Rebecca and Xavier lived out their days on the ranch they had built together, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had helped shape. They grew old together with grace and gratitude, never taking for granted the second chance they had been given at love and happiness. When Rebecca finally passed at the age of 78, with Xavier holding her hand and their children gathered around, her last words were of gratitude for a life well lived and love well given. Xavier followed her 3 years later, and they were buried side by side in the San Elizario cemetery, their graves marked with simple stones bearing their names and the dates that bracketed lives rich with meaning and purpose. The Morgan Grant Ranch continued for generations, passed down through their children and grandchildren, each new generation adding their own chapters to its story. But always, the founding story remained the same. A widow who refused every suitor and a quiet cowboy who fixed her fence without asking, and the love that grew between them, steady and sure as the Texas sun, enduring as the desert itself.